Hi, Cara.
Hi, Vanessa.
So, part of what we're going to talk about today is social media and tech use and online socializing and all of those things. And you may walk away feeling like, oh, well, I really wish we talked about this or that. So, we're here to say in our membership, there's tons and tons of information about it. You can look in our searchable library for the bunches of episodes we've done in it. There's stuff in our newsletter that we've written about it. You can always ask the awkward bot, our best friend. But to cover all of it, you need all the resources in the Less Awkward membership. And today is one part of the conversation. So, Cara, I know that you have one place you would really like to begin this episode.
I do. Vanessa, I want to start by saying that this is not an episode intended to tear any individual person or persons down. That is an ugly look everywhere, especially in the world of health information, and we see it. It does us no good to rant about information providers when we don't 100% agree with either the way they provide their information or the conclusions that they come to. Well, except when information that they're providing is completely wrong, but that's a different issue. We have dragged our feet on commenting about a book that has taken the world in general and parenting in particular by storm. And that book is The Anxious Generation. Now, it's a bestseller for many good reasons, mostly that it distills years and years of data about technology down to some really important teachable points. But it gets some things wrong, mostly biological, and we'll get into that. And more importantly, or really, Vanessa, I think it's maybe the media coverage of the book, is adding to the cacophony of fear-based parenting. So when it comes to growing up, these days, it feels like there are really only two legs of the stool, okay? One are the kids, the passive victims, and the other is big tech, the vicious aggressors. Now, big tech can be replaced by pornographers or child predators or other evil-minded spirits, okay? But that's it. Those are the two players that are presented. The third and fourth legs of the stool, parents and then other trusted adults, so educators and mentors and coaches and family members and all those people, they are often painted as passive bystanders who watch helplessly as their children spiral down a deep hole of mental health disorders and anxiety and depression, right? And sometimes parents and trusted adults are also blamed, but usually it's for their lack of backbone. So they give over to their kids' demands for fully accessorized phones at younger and younger ages, and there we go. We are deep believers that information can and should be presented in an actionable way. So yes, some of the data is scary, but if it's presented from a positive point of view, like here's a ton of information that illustrates a massive problem, but before presenting it, we promise to give you ways through, right? Tools to make things better, steps you can take to reduce the inevitability of doom and gloom. And in fact, we're going to start with these, and then we're going to present the data, and then we're going to circle back and give you tons of tools to become upstanders instead of bystanders, right? If that's the way that we all approach this, well, then parents and trusted adults would feel emboldened, not shamed. Because the reality is that clickbait headlines are almost always scary. That's why we click. But as a result, we haven't just evolved to have an anxious generation of kids. We have an even more anxious generation of adults raising them. And while we basically never toot our own horns, Vanessa, one thing I know that we get right is that we approach it all from the opposite direction. We use science and data presented in a way that informs and hopefully even entertains sometimes, and absolutely diminishes fear.
The end. So let's talk about the book and your reaction, because I will say from personal experience, having read the book, I had that exact reaction, Cara, that you're talking about parents across the country are having, which is a sense of fear and desperation in the face of kids' relationship to technology and families' management of technology. And I personally finished the book and thought about all the ways in which, according to him, I had failed my children and ruined my family and maybe ruined my children for future years and maybe even collective generations to come. I mean, there was a real sense of, oh my God, like I did those things, or I let my children do those things. And I was flashing back to, choices we made and rules we created and limits we set or didn't set or any of those things. And then I took a step back and I actually asked one of my kids their opinion. I told them I was reading this book, and my kid was like, I actually think you did pretty well. And so I took a deep breath and I sat back up and I said, okay, let's have this conversation without the shame and the fear as a parent of the ways in which we have done poorly. And let's think about what good we can take from this massively best-selling book and where we can be critics of it, constructive critics, and make some decisions using a more critical eye in a useful and helpful way. So, do you want to start with, the glaring thing to me is what he gets wrong when he talks about puberty. And I feel like we have a responsibility to talk about that at the top.
I totally agree. Jonathan Haidt is an incredibly bright and thoughtful journalist and researcher. He understands where he's collecting his data. He presents tons and tons and tons of data. What's interesting is there is a lack of internal consistency between the amount and sort of thoroughness, I would say, of the data he presents on the social science side.
Correct.
And the science and biology of puberty. So I do wish he had called us. Not going to lie.
I don't know if there's another book that uses the word puberty as much as we do that, like, besides us, this book might have the word puberty at, like, it's number 2 in the amount of times.
There's a lot written about puberty. And I think the thing that the first thing I want to make sure, first of all, if anyone knows him, give him a holler and tell him to call us. We'd love to have him on because we'd love to have this conversation with him, actually. So puberty is never defined in the book, which is a very interesting thing. It is used as a synonym for adolescence when convenient, and it is used as a marker of a biological moment at times, but it is never defined. And when it is used as a marker of a biological moment, it really suggests, the way it's used, that puberty happens over this teeny tiny little span. Like there's this one part of the book that walks through like age 8, age 10, age 12. And tucked in there is sort of like, here's puberty, like at this moment. And there's no, I want to say there's no recognition, because I actually think it's just a miss, that puberty actually occupies the entire amount of time that he is covering when he talks about the social science data. So he really rolls back to 8 and 10-year-olds and looks at the impact of technology in general and cell phones in particular on those kids. But I don't think he knows that those kids are in the earliest stages of puberty. And likewise, sometimes he teases out teenage data from tween data, and sometimes he doesn't. But I don't think he knows is that even through the teenage years, all the way through when all of that data is being collected on social media use and all this, they're all still in puberty. And it's significant because the other bit of biology that he gets wrong, and it made me want to cry, is brain development.
Before we get to brain development, one of the things I want to talk about is that he treats the onset of puberty and the duration of puberty as if it's a monolith. But we know that the average onset for girls is between 8 and 9, and between 9 and 10 for boys. But then there's years where other kids are beginning their pubertal journeys, and that's also normal. So it's also considered normal for girls to start much later, like 13 or 14, and for boys to start later. And then they're in puberty for years after that. So they may be in puberty through high school and even through college. And so to treat puberty as if it is a biological monolith is totally inaccurate. And all of you know that because you listen to us and you read our book, but it feels irresponsible that he doesn't define it, that he doesn't talk about the age span, that he doesn't allow for the variation of early bloomers and late bloomers and the experience of those children, right? Like he dumps a massive term on all of us without any of the nuance, subtlety, or definitions.
And he doesn't contextualize the importance of rising and falling sex hormones in the brain, which is another huge piece, right? That's exactly what you're getting at, that some 8-year-olds have estrogen or testosterone coursing through their brain, and some don't have it until they're 13 or 14. But and so those experiences are really different, but all of them over this wide swath of years and years and years are riding this roller coaster, and those hormones surging through their brain make their brains feel different, therefore make their emotional response different, changes their self-perception, their self-esteem, the way they experience life on these apps, which he writes in great detail about. So all of this is deeply interconnected. And then there's the brain development piece, which is also very inaccurate. It's like these are the two big inaccuracies in the book. So there is a comment in the book about the prefrontal cortex will not be fully formed until 20. And when I got there, Vanessa, I gasped because he's got all of his numbers right on the social science side. And I just couldn't figure out why that was in there. And then there was a doubling down of, there's not much on brain development, but where there's content, it's very clear that the notion is that by the time a kid is 20, and in fact, he walks through the legal age gating of so many different things in our society, which is a really important argument that he makes. But it's almost as if he is equating, and I think he might actually equate turning 21 and being able to go into a bar and being able to buy nicotine and having a fully developed brain. And that's just not the case.
On top of that, he conflates puberty with brain development. So he conflates the process, the very linear process of brain development, which I think in a second car, you should run people through in like 30 seconds because I think it's important with the stages of sexual maturation, physical development, emotional changes. Yes, as we often talk about, sex hormones bathe the brain as well as the rest of the body and impact moods and behavior and emotions as well as all the physical changes. But that is not kids' brain development. The brain development is a separate process. Can you just remind people super quickly what brain development is? Because he talks about it in the book, but he acts as if it is equivalent to
this is
puberty.
Such an important point, Vanessa, because he uses this phrase, the great rewiring. That is a phrase that is threaded throughout the book. It's a great catchphrase. But if you're going to talk about rewiring, you actually have to then couch it in accurate description of brain development, because that's the wiring that we're talking about. So yeah, 30 seconds. Ready to time me?
I won't time you because I know you'll go over.
No, I'm doing it. 30 seconds. Brains develop in two ways. They prune and they myelinate. Pruning means you get rid of the neurons and the neuronal connections that you don't use. So that's like a trimming down, like a pruning of a tree. You trim down the number of neurons in your brain over time. That happens throughout our entire life. That's not really the type of brain maturation we're talking about with tweens and teens and 20-somethings. What we're talking about with their brains is myelination. Myelination is the insulation of nerve fibers, covering nerve fibers with fat cells called myelin that allows electrical signals to travel faster from one end to the other. And that happens very linearly. It starts at the bottom and works its way to the top. It starts on the inside, works its way out. By middle school, it is halfway up, halfway out. That is where the limbic system lives. That is why the emotional brain is so dominant, because signals are sent to and from the emotional center of the brain faster. And myelination will not finish. It will not reach all the way to the end of the prefrontal cortex until kids are at least in their mid-20s. There is data that shows that for some kids, it is later, it is closer to 30. And that is why we say the prefrontal cortex is not fully on board, fully mature until they are in their late 20s, almost 30, because the signals can't get there fast enough.
And so that is a chronological process. Whether a 12-year-old kid will be at unless they are neurodiverse or have other health issues or developmental issues that might affect us, a typical developing child who is 12 will have a similarly mature brain to another typically developed 12-year-old child. But their stage of puberty could be vastly different because they are two different processes. And the fact that he conflates these two things is so casual to me that it was really, really quite astounding. Now, not everyone is as obsessed with puberty as we are, but the target audience of this book are parents of kids and caregivers and educators of kids entering this stage, in this stage, or just departing this stage. And so to be so precise on so much data and information and so casual about conflating two physiological processes and terminology that is so critical to the premise of the book, I find quite astounding, even though there's other aspects of the book that I think are terrific.
And it matters. And it matters because, and then we're going to stop beating this dead horse, but it matters because when a person is in puberty, the way their brain responds to the world around them is impacted by the hormones that control their puberty. And so if we're writing about anything that is impacting the way a person feels, their emotional reaction, their social interactions, their relationships, right? We have to acknowledge those factors, those major factors that are also playing a role. But this will get us to some of the things that he gets right on, because I think this is an important transition.
There's brain development aspects that are irrespective of puberty, and that there's right.
Correct.
So it's both things. It's both how puberty and sex hormones affect it, and things that will operate independently of all kids at this stage, in this stage of brain development. And so I think holding both of those things is super important when we explore how we navigate and manage kids' relationship to technology, social media, and their relationship to each other and the world around them.
He gets a lot right. And I think we need to start going through some of that because it's critical to acknowledge what he gets right. And I'm going to start at the end. I'm going to start with the first wave of press about this book, like before he was on Oprah, but the very first wave was sort of, he has 4 solutions to this problem of childhood. And his 4 solutions are: number 1, no smartphones before high school. Number 2, no social media before 16. Number 3, phone-free schools. And number 4, unsupervised play and childhood independence. And little side note, we did do a workshop yesterday about how to manage summer for kids as they are trying to push on their independence levers at different ages. And I think it's very, very on brand for this conversation. So for those of you who are interested in our members, you can check out the workshops in our membership. Okay, that was a side note. So I want to walk through his 4 solutions because I think they come from very good places and the data backs them up. And I wish they had A, been presented on page 1 of the book, and B, had been written in a way that started with, hey, parents and caregivers, even if these don't apply to how you're doing things right now in your home, this is the goal based on the data. And I encourage you to see how close you can get to it, because you may see that it helps. Like to me, that's the non-fear-based way in, right? But let's start at no smartphones before high school. So you and I have done this podcast for 4 years, 4 years, 4 seasons, 4 something. And I cannot count the number of episodes where we say, and every person who works in this field has said when we ask the prompt or when we present the prompt or ask the question, no, kids should not be on the internet and on apps 24/7 on a phone starting at age 10, which is the average age of first phone ownership. He is not coming up with something radical. He is coming up with something rational. He suggests flip phones. We have suggested perhaps a slightly easier path for parents who feel bamboozled into smartphones, which is fine. Just strip down the smartphone. Just offer a dumb smartphone where there are just no apps on it and where there are some parental controls so you can't download apps. Like there are lots of ways to get to this particular solution. It is an interesting and good solution. However, there's on the one hand, his recommendation that it's really the apps that are on the phone that he's pointing to all the data that shows all of the downsides of that. He doesn't point to iPads, computers, any of the technology required by and at schools. And we have to talk about those part and parcel. And he also doesn't talk about how we can gradually toe into apps where we honor the development of a kid. Go, Vanessa.
Yeah. I mean, he does acknowledge the use of educational technology and screens in schools to some extent. He does recognize there's recreational time on screens and there is other time on screens. And I wish he had done more with that. I wish he'd presented more research about the time spent on screens during the school day. I wish there was more on the impact of AI and learning on screens and the loss of kind of handwriting and memorization. You know, I do wish if he was going to go through this and the impact on kids that he had given us a more balanced view on those things. Having said that, he recognizes that like this is where we are right now and to differentiate these two things. I think one of the things that I find, as you said, Cara, that there wasn't a lot of advice about how to manage it and how to toe in. And we did a wonderful episode. We weren't wonderful. They were wonderful. Emily Weinstein and Carrie James from Behind Their Screens wrote a terrific book about really into the nitty gritty of managing these conversations in our families and our households and toeing in and pulling back and navigating and managing. And I think that is the place where I would point people for really specific guidance on that, because we're not going to really cover that today. Listen, in terms of like smartphones and all of that, I know because I'm sitting here thinking of it, people whose kids are not yet in high school and who have smartphones, you're like, but what do I do? Like,
that's right.
Do I take it away? Do I strip it down? Do I remove all the apps? Do I like essentially what will feel like your kid is that they're being punished. And yet you're like, no, I'm just trying to do what's best for you. I do think, Cara, it's worth having that conversation today.
Oh, it's really important. So the reason I hate being part of the parenting expert world, and I fully reject that title, as I know you do as well, Vanessa.
We laugh every time people call us parenting experts.
I laugh /
I'm like, just sit in my house for an hour and then you'll really know that I'm not.
But one of the reasons I hate it is it makes it seem like an analog set of decisions. You know, you either do this or you do this. One way is right, one way is wrong. And of course, we spend our entire work life debunking that. There's no one right way through this for anyone. What we know, based upon all of the consumer data and research data out there, is that there are millions and millions and millions of kids with smartphones in their hands who, if you're reading this book and you really want to follow the recommendations, those smartphones need to be ripped out of their hands, right? I mean,
that's what it feels like. If you read this book, it feels like you need to drive over to your kid's school, rip the phone out of their hands, stamp all over it, and throw it in the closest body of water.
And I will say, based on the data, would that be a great solution for many kids? Yes. Okay. I take issue with some of the little bits here and there, and we can talk about the part where all the benefits of social media are completely diminished.
In 4 sentences.
And that bummed me out because there are real benefits of social media, but there are bigger risks to social media. And so net, would I love for every person under the age of 16 to not have a smartphone? You bet. But most of them do. And it's not, that genie is out of the bottle. It is not realistic to recommend that those kids no longer have it. Now, one could argue this is a forward-facing book that is trying to embolden parents of younger kids to delay. Great. Like, to me, that's actually a smart thing to give all this data to help parents whose oldest kid is 7 or 8 or 9 a reason to kick the can down the road a lot further. Great. But we do have truly tens of millions of kids who are in an age demo where we got to come up with a middle ground solution because they own smartphones.
And what he barely recognizes, and again, this is not I don't mean this conversation to be a dump fest, but I do think any point we're bringing up is really important to help us be critical consumers of this content, are the choices we made in COVID and what we did in the pandemic in order to physically and emotionally and intellectually survive a very trying and extended period of time. And so there are choices we made about what access to technology our kids had and what platforms they were on and what types of technology they had. And so in an ideal world, had the world not shut down for essentially 2 years, sure, we would have made different choices, given kids access later, all of those things. But there are a lot of things that were set on a path. And I think it would be helpful for parents to know, what can we constructively engage on and potentially walk back without people feeling like, just as they were trying to survive a really tough period of time, they utterly failed their children in the same moment.
Okay, so I'm going to come up with a couple of suggestions because I think this conversation is pointless if we don't offer some productive ways through. So one is, we are big believers that you share data and information science with kids. Kids should know the data about the impacts of smartphones in general and social media in particular. They should know that data. It should be presented to them not as oh, you young kids, the phonograph is going to ruin you. But really, it should be presented as, look, man, here's the data. Here's a summary. If you don't want to read the whole book, here's a summary. You can read the Sparks Note version. Just know what this stuff is doing to you and how it's making you feel. And I want to engage you in a conversation about what you want to do about it. That's number one. It always works better to engage a kid in a conversation about how they are being manipulated and ways that they can make choices about their own wellness, whether it's their physical wellness or their mental wellness, right? Number two is, would someone please develop some technology where it's easier for parents to actually shut down access to some of this stuff? And likewise for schools. I mean, I'm sorry, like, we have how many satellites circling the globe, and yet we haven't figured out a way to have a school basically be able to scramble and shut off access to smartphones and social media apps, et cetera, during school hours in an affordable manner, which should be free for every school. Like, there are ways through, and we should be really looking at this as a public health issue, which is, I think, the strength of this book, is he presents the public health perspective, and then we should be doing something about it. But we need to engage all of the the relevant players. We need to engage kids because kids don't want to be manipulated. They don't want to be going down rabbit holes. They don't want to be told what to think or what to do. And we have to engage educators who are, I read an incredible article last weekend about a teacher, a storied teacher who just said, I can't do it anymore because kids are, and it's not on their phones. It's on their phones and on their laptops, watching shows, shopping, playing video games. This is not a phone issue. This is, and sorry to go on, but there's a distinction made in the book between internet and social media and the ills of internet versus the ills of social media. And the argument goes, it's social media that's bad, not internet. And I completely disagree. And you talk to any educator and they will tell you social media is not the issue in classrooms. Social media is not designed for their laptops. So kids don't want to be on Instagram and TikTok on a laptop, but they are absolutely shopping and gaming and watching movies.
Right. So when we think about practical stuff and conversations with kids, if you are sitting in this demographic and you have, like in my case, a 14-year-old who's had a smartphone for a year or two, and you are freaking out, here's a few things you can do. Like, make sure, we're a broken record, it's turned in at a certain hour at night, long before bed, and it is charged. All devices are charged outside the room. When your kid gets home at the end of the day, where is their phone going? Is it next to them while they do their homework or when they go and shower? It should be turned in and there should be designated time, because one of the issues is the time online, whatever version of online it is, bleeds into it, right? It's designed to be addictive. It's designed to not want to be put down. Is your kid watching TV and also looking at their phone at the same time? If they're doing that, Kara, you always say, multitasking is not a thing. Task switching is a thing. And so their attention is affected by constantly pinging back and forth 2 or 3 different screens. So some of that is just setting up, no matter what age they are, no matter what platforms there are, setting up limits and boundaries about where their phone is when they're doing other tasks, where their laptops are when they're going to bed or doing other things. And that is really easy to say to a kid with the science. Listen, you're going to perform better in school if you're not doing your homework with your phone by you. You're going to sleep better at night if the devices are out of the room. We're going to have a better time together if we're watching a movie and you're not also on your phone. Like, those are rational things. This is not saying I am yanking this phone away or I'm yanking this device away and you will never ever be able to do it again. You're saying, no, here's what good research is telling us. We're going to change the parameters a little bit.
And I want to speak specifically to his recommendation that there's no social media before 16. We as a country can and must do better about age gating.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree.
I mean, hallelujah to him for drawing a firm line. Let's start with porn. Before we even talk about social media, Gail Dines and others have been pounding the globe. She goes all over. She speaks to governments everywhere, trying to age gate porn. And you know what? A lot of countries do.
Yeah.
And it's not that hard. And we don't. In the name of freedom or whatever it is, we don't. We need to age gate porn. We should age gate social media. Great. Let's have a national debate about the age. His suggestion is 16. I think that's rational. I really do. In terms of any addictive behavior, substance, whatever, we know if you delay, the risk of addiction is lower. We know because, again, back to basic brain development and myelination and the path through, and it's chronologic, as you explained, we know delay is better. So yes, let's delay with age gating. And we have to stop being so afraid of using that tool in this country.
And the argument against that, and I've been in conversations where this has come up, which is like, well, we can't ask people for IDs. And I think that's partially out of inclusiveness for undocumented folks. But as he points out in the book, there are third-party verification companies who can help verify age without, storing sensitive data or the risk of hacking or, compromising somebody's status in a particular country. There are ways to do it. And I really believe, and if anybody needs any more encouragement, how about keeping kids from being victims of sexual predators online? Like, if for no other reason that you're going to get on board, we know, and he's so funny because he fear mongers in some ways and doesn't fear monger in other ways. And he really doesn't get into this much at all. He talks about how we're not supervising kids enough online and we're supervising to them too much in real life and that we need to change the balance. But in particular, kids, young people of all ages are really at risk of sexual predation through online platforms, sextortion, blackmail, all sorts of stuff. And so if no other reason, age gating, social media, that is a great reason. Car, I want to talk about the phone-free schools.
Yep, his
topic.
third recommendation. So we did no smartphones before high school was his first recommendation. No social media before 16 is his second. His third is phone-free schools. Go ahead, Vanessa.
So I have personal experience with this because it was clear to me that one of my kids, and I would say this if he was sitting right here, was really having trouble having a phone somewhere in his vicinity during the school day. And that technically my kids are not allowed to have school phones, like that's supposed to be in their locker or their pocket or whatever. But it was clear to me that one of my kids needed to have the phone nowhere near him. And I asked the school to have everyone turn in their phones because it was clear to me that he was not the only one struggling with this. And for a variety of reasons, they were unable to execute on that. I said, fine, but my kid can't have his phone. So he's got to hand it in the morning when he gets to school and he picks it up in the afternoon. And if I have to get a hold of him, I send an email to the administrator in the middle school and she puts a note on his locker and he gets the information he needs. Or when he picks up his phone at the end of the day, he gets the text from me or his siblings. And that's how we do it. And I explained why we were doing it. I explained why I was setting up this rule. And that was the rule. And that's what we did. And it's been a lot better. Like, I agree that kids should not have their phones. And by the way, the head of my kid's school has implemented some things like no walking around in headphones around the school campus, no phones in the lunchroom, some things like that. Because as Jonathan Haidt talks about, there are communal impacts of having everybody on their phones.
Which he describes in a really beautiful and sad way, walking into a cafeteria or dining hall or a college classroom and 30 people are in the room and no one's talking and you can hear a pin drop because everyone's on their phone. I mean, it's right. And no one's surprised by that description. I don't disagree. Why we have phones in school and why people have pushed back, it's what's landed us in this very complicated place in the first place, is in the name of safety.
Mm-hmm.
Schools don't always feel like the safest place. We have mass shootings in this country, and some number of them happen on school campuses. And when push comes to shove, there are a lot of parents who say, my kid has to have a phone so that if, God forbid, they're in a situation like that, they can call me or they can call for help. I hear that. I don't disagree with that rationale. It's just that if you look at the likelihood of that scenario compared to the likelihood of learning loss and social loss and emotional devastation because you have a phone all day at school, the numbers don't compare. And I don't think we're adequately weighing one against the other. And so I give him a lot of credit for fighting this fight. I hope he wins this fight and we all win this fight. I hope schools become phone free. Frankly, in a perfect world, if I could wave a wand, phones would be not allowed on school campuses, not allowed on school campuses. If you walk in with one, there should be a central clearinghouse, like a drop zone where everyone turns in their phone. And signals should be scrambled so that when kids are on all of the tech devices they need to be on at school, for school, they don't have the distraction that is one click away, and they are not able to shop and game and watch movies. Vanessa, you and I are incredibly hardworking, productive people who can put our head down and like work for hours and hours and hours. You tell me, when we are on Zoom, how often, don't lie, how often do you open a tab and check Instagram? How often do you like check your email? I do. I'm going to tell you right now, I've got a fully developed brain and I'm a really good hard worker, and I am fully distracted, not by my phone, by the computer that I am on while I am Zooming with you, I've done during podcast recordings, I've been known to see something pop in and I'm like, we got to check this in the middle of a deep conversation that's being recorded. And we have developed brains. So he is right and some. There needs to be more.
Right. I mean, I think I
like how you didn't have to answer that because I answered for myself.
I mostly end up having to parent while we spend hours and hours on Zoom. I would say 90% of my quote multitasking is actually dealing with my children. And one of my children, without fail, will call during every podcast recording.
I can't believe he hasn't called yet.
I know. Well, because he just walked over. I could see him in the window of my office door because he didn't need to call because he's actually home now. But
it's why you like to podcast so much, because it's when your child calls you. You're like, oh, I know he'll call.
I mean, I should just book a keynote every night because my kid will call every time we're in a keynote. So yes, I mean, we're susceptible. And this is I will quickly mention the fourth one, which I think the fourth reform, and then I want to talk a little bit, give people a tiny bit more guidance before we get off. So more unsupervised play and childhood independence. And he goes all the way back, to younger kids and works his way up. And there are so many variables in this statement about where people live and what childcare access they have and what kind of schools their kids attend and what is the safety of the neighborhoods in which they live and what resources do they have? Are there sidewalks and streetlights? And, there's a million reasons why this general thing is a much more complex reform in some ways than any of the other recommendations he makes, because childhood is so deeply variable. Having said that, I think we can speak to the independence question, which is the question that we get the most. We just recorded a workshop on independence during the summer. So our members can watch that. And we walk through elementary school age kids, middle school age kids, and high school age kids, and how you manage on-ramping to independence. And I think it is critical. So we're not going to spend time on that. But what I want to get back to, Cara, is
just to say that if numbers 1, 2, and 3 happen, if there are no smartphones before high school, if there's no social media before 16, and if there's no cell phone allowed in a school, then by definition, there should be more unsupervised play and childhood independence, I think is the simplest, and that is true.
Right. I mean, so the corollary to that is that he dismisses the value of online interaction, play, socialization. So like he's prioritizing one over the other. And there's good reasons why kids need in real life interactions. They need the risk taking. They need to learn the skills of reading people's facial expressions and body language and negotiation tactics and all of the things that happen. That's all great. And
totally. And if there's less tech around, then by default, people will do it. If you're not on your phone in the cafeteria, you're going to talk to someone. It's like, and this is the same. And I think this is, you've nailed it in terms of how he landed there and how complicated it is, and yet how it's a zero-sum game. And at the end of the day, you've only got so many hours in a day. And if you're on a screen, you're on a screen. And if you're not, you're not. And there you go.
But he dismisses, like, for kids socializing online, playing games, doing a variety of things, FaceTiming, whatever, like, that is a big part of kids' lives. That is a way that they socialize and they enjoy it. And it's fun for them. And I think to out of hand dismiss it and write it off as not valuable or bad or wrong is, I find, one of the most complex things for us to change for tweens and teens living today.
And I think this gets to the sort of a final piece of advice. I'm going to offer mine, and it's a distillation of this. So the book, it melds sometimes the idea of being online versus being on social media. And It spends a lot of time defining what social media is and isn't. And he actually has these 4 parameters that you must meet in order to be called social media. It's very clear. I agree with his definitions of how he structures it. And yet what you're describing is spot on, which is we, the old guard, the old fogies, we are good with collecting the information, the data. We're good with being afraid of the technological shift. We're less comfortable with recognizing that along with technology, so too evolve social norms and social interactions. And, in my world as a pediatrician, in our world as podcasters and entrepreneurs in this space, I think you and I will agree vehemently that gaming together on a Discord server or on a Twitch server is social. And dancing together on a FaceTime or on a shared, app or whatever is social. And watching a YouTube video and then creating your own and doing it with friends and then commenting together and being in conversation is social. And so neither of us wants to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I think that's where you're landing with his recommendation. And I agree.
And honestly, what I would do for people sitting, listening to this, and maybe you've read the book, maybe you haven't, is sit down with his 4 proposed reforms and sit down with your partner first and see what their reaction is. And then sit down with the kid in your life and be like, I just read this book and it's like getting a lot of press and this guy is everywhere and everyone's freaking out. And I'm trying to figure out how I want to think about it. Here's what he is suggesting. What do you think? Like, what works? What doesn't work? What might be hard? What is realistic? What do you think would be a good thing? What do you think would be a terrible thing? And see where your kid comes out. And I'm not talking about a 7-year-old, but I'm talking about an 11-year-old or a 13-year-old or a 15-year-old. Like, get curious with your kid. And maybe what they'll say to you is what my kid said to me was like, hey, on the whole, I think you did a pretty good job. And I think maybe here's where we could change things a little bit. And here's where I wouldn't change anything at all. So I'm going to sit with this. I'm going to think about this, Cara. I know you will. And the conversation will continue. And maybe we'll even have Jonathan Haidt on the podcast with us to talk about some of it. But I want people to feel like you can do this. You're not a bad parent. You haven't ruined your child. We are all doing the best we can. And he has like 2 sentences in the whole book saying to parents, like, I know this is hard. And it's like 3/4 of the way through the book. I know this is hard and let's try our best and let's see. That should be up top. And you set it up top and we're going to say it at the end as well. We're doing our best. There's new data all the time. There's new technology all the time. Our kids are rapidly evolving at the same time that all of this is coming at us. And we're just trying our hardest to do right by our kids.
Thank you, Vanessa.
I'm exhausted. I need to take a nap now. Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.